garden where the passions are let loose, and perhaps Virginia Woolf, Kew Gardens, or Between the Acts, and moving on. Oh, and there are some lovely things. Carol Shields wrote a book about a landscape gardener, Larry's Party, and recently, and this is the great discovery for me, and I'm reading it passionately every moment I can at the moment, because I was told by some very good friends in Cape Town that there's a book called The Garden of the Evening Mists. And I've started reading it, and I have so many notes already that I'm afraid you're going to be bored stiff if you come to the lecture. But a lovely one to sort of bring us up to date at the end, perhaps. Anyway.
And is it 5 pictures, please? Not
5. Well, I would like it to be 5, yes. This year I'm so desperately trying to catch up that I'm quite relieved it's 3. I've got to hand the book in by July, and then I'll be human after that. Okay, let's start, because we don't want to waste our precious time. Well, I always start by saying it's been more than usually difficult to find a poem, but honestly, the sweat that goes into finding the right poem is something else. It's a great pleasure, of course, because, as you know, I long to teach poetry. I was instructed severely that courses on the novel were needed, so the poetry sneaked in beforehand. But it seems to me that this is really, this book, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, is about love of many different kinds, which is why it's particularly difficult to find one suitable poem for it. But the thing they have in common, I suspect, is that each of them feels the precariousness of love, the uncertainty of love. I mean, the passion, certainly, and the longing, but the uncertainty. And I've chosen, and some of you will know in advance that I'd chosen it, Yevtushenko. Colours. When your face appeared over my crumpled life, at first I understood only the poverty of what I have. Then its particular light on woods, on rivers, on the sea, became my beginning in the coloured world in which I had not yet had my beginning. I am so frightened. I am so frightened of the unexpected sunrise finishing, of revelations and tears and the excitement finishing. I don't fight it. My love is this fear. I nourish it who can nourish nothing, love's slipshod watchman. Fear hems me in. I am conscious that these minutes are short and that the colours in my eyes will vanish when your face sets. The title of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, as some of you will know, is taken from a poem by a late 19th century writer, William Sharp. And the poem's called The Lonely Hunter, a dialogue of a kind between two lovers. I say of a kind because one of them is dead. Both of them consigned to a future in which, as both conclude their individual meditations in the poem, their heart is a lonely hunter that hunts on a lonely hill. The man who wrote the poem did so, and this is very interesting, under a woman's name, Fiona MacLeod, a mingling of sexual identities that would have been very much appreciated by the bisexual Carson McCullers. The phrase, "the heart is a lonely hunter," is a precise yet poetic description of McCullers' main theme and point of view in the novel. And the choice of two deaf mutes around which the story is centred seems to me equally inspired, very puzzling when you open the book. For in their inability, literally, to communicate fully either with each other or with the outside world, they can stand for most of McCullers' freakish characters. Now, the word freakish is not mine. I wouldn't dare use it, but there's a lot about freaks in the book, and by freaks is really meant eccentrics, outsiders, people who don't fit in. And to have 5 people who don't fit in all together is rather intriguing. The main theme is set out in the novel's opening pages, which introduces us to the strange relationship between the two deaf mutes. John Singer, the pivot around which the plot revolves, is almost the exact opposite of the man he loves deeply, the man with whom he's living in a small unidentified town in the American South. Spiros Antonopoulos, another deaf mute whom he adores, but who's lazy, overweight, mentally backward, and incapable of loving anyone but himself. The last, of course, is the most disturbing feature of all. Extract 2, and I know you've got to Extract 2. In the town, there were two deaf mutes, and they were always together. Early every morning, they would come out from the house where they lived and walk arm in arm down the street to work. The two friends were very different. The one who always steered the way was an obese and dreamy Greek. In the summer, he would come out wearing a yellow or green polo shirt stuffed deeply into his trousers in front and hanging loose behind. When it was colder, he wore over this a shapeless grey sweater. His face was round and oily, with half-closed eyelids and lips that curved in a gentle, stupid smile. The other mute was tall. His eyes had a quick, intelligent expression. He was always immaculate and very soberly dressed. It's an extraordinary introduction to a novel, isn't it? When the book opens, the two men are sharing an apartment, Singer working daily. He's in a skilled job. He's in a jeweller's. He's an engraver in a jeweller's. And Antonopoulos at his Greek cousin's fruit and confectionery shop, indulging in his obsession with food and with cooking. Singer gives, Antonopoulos takes. But the relationship works in the way that such relationships often do, of course. I mean, if both took or both gave, it wouldn't, would it? But this works, although for the reader it's most frustrating. It's unconventional, but it works. Then Antonopoulos, who's becoming increasingly antisocial, including, and I think this is the last straw for everybody, peeing on the bank, the opposite wall of the bank, or the wall of the bank opposite the shop, which really just finishes his cousin off. And he ships him off to a mental hospital, which of course leaves Singer on his own. He's left doubly alone, isolated not just by his physical condition of deafness and inability to communicate, but also by the loss of love, the loss of the beloved. He then moves into a cheaper boarding house run by the parents of one of the four other main characters. I'm sorry it's necessary to tell you the plot, but I think just a little bit of it to show you how they relate to each other. An adolescent girl known as Mick. I did think of coming as Mick, but she wears a T-shirt and shorts, and I wasn't quite up to it. Wasn't quite up to T-shirt and shorts. With this novel, with this move to the boarding house, he becomes unwittingly the magnet or focus for a group of disparate individuals. Quite fascinating. They're all drawn to the deaf mute. And their only shared characteristic among these five people is loneliness. The heart is a lonely hunter. These individuals include, beside the adolescent girl, Mick, there's Dr. Benedict Mady Copeland, who's a black doctor, Biff Brannan, a cafe owner, widowed early on in the story, and Jake Blount, a communist. And of course, ingeniously, we might interpret that as representing, respectively, problems attached to adolescence with Mick, race with the doctor, because this is the American South and this is the 1930s, sexuality with Biff Brannan, who isn't quite sure whether he wouldn't prefer to be a mother rather than a man, and politics, Jake Blount, the communist, in an unsympathetic society. Mainly because of Singer's disability, his outward character is vague and undefined. the other characters are able, therefore, and this is the most intriguing bit of the story, to attribute to him any of the things they want him to have, the qualities they want him to have, creating their understanding of Singer from the reflections of their own desires. And look, they're going to hand you your page, and now you can relax. Singer's muteness allows them to articulate their feelings. Have you ever talked to somebody who doesn't talk back? It's almost as though they make you talk. I mean, I resist talking to people who don't talk back because I say the most terrible things. But it's as though they think that he can understand everything they say. They come to believe that Singer possesses the inner serenity that they lack. So without ever realizing it, Singer himself becomes a catalyst of sorts, helping the other four to realize their dreams. Well, it's a rather crude outline of the plot, and it makes it sound highly contrived, but in fact it's played out in a convincingly realistic and natural way as Singer goes about his daily business. Since it's a small town, it seems perfectly natural that they should all meet. I mean, if this were a big town, you'd think this is rather odd, they're always bumping into each other. Their main meeting place is the 24-hour cafe, the New York cafe run by Biff Brannan. Singer and Jake Blount, the alcoholic communist, take their meals there, and the others drift in and out. The only person who can't go to the cafe, of course, as you might anticipate, is Dr. Benedict Mady Copeland, although Jake Blount, the communist, tries to take him into the cafe and is told, "We don't allow people of your colour here." Well, he says something ruder than that, but I won't repeat it. But Dr. Copeland quickly becomes linked to the other characters through the second main setting. So although it's a rather obvious plot, it's done fairly naturally. And the second main setting is the cheap boarding house where he has gone to live after his partner is sent off to the hospital. And that belongs to Mick Kelly's parents. So they're all there. And what then happens is that his room, Singer's room, at the top of the house becomes the kind of focus for all these other characters. And they meet each other up and down the stairs, and they get to know each other indirectly. And one by one, they come into contact with the other characters. With Jake, an unlikely soulmate of Dr. Copeland, because both Jake and Copeland are angry men. One is angry about the fate of his people, the black people, and one is angry about the fate of the working class whites. And both are even angrier with their own people who won't do much about it and who are passive under all of this. However, although the other characters in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter believe that Singer is a man of great wisdom and serenity, he is actually as lonely as they all are, possibly even lonelier. Ironically, in an artful shaping of the plot, he attributes to his friend, Antonopolis, all the qualities they attribute to him. So he thinks, oh, he understands me, he knows me, and all the time we as the reader know that he doesn't at all. Antonopolis is as unaware of Singer's concerns as Singer is of those of the characters drawn to him. But when the Greek dies, Singer commits suicide, unable to bear his own loneliness and isolation. Only the cafe owner, Biff Brannan, suspects that, in fact, it's a creation of the group's individual needs, a reflection of their own hopes and desires. After managing Singer's funeral, Biff concludes, quote, that there was something not natural about it all, something like an ugly joke. So it's a very weird book, actually, but it really pulls you in. It's a parable, and I don't need to say this to you probably, but I shall. It's a parable of the human condition, of human isolation, of the craving to communicate, and of the impossibility of human communication. And also, perhaps, as the critic Walter Allen puts it, of the inescapable delusions attendant upon the inescapable human need to love. You know people who've been attracted to a very shapely blonde with long legs and pretend that she has a brain, don't you? It's putting it rather crudely, but you know what I mean. Mick Kelly is forced to abandon her education at the end of the book, and all the rest of the characters are left with their dreams in pieces. So it's not a hopeful book. Maybe I am putting you off, but it's a beautiful book and it's a poetic book. The overwhelming impression of the book is not one of despair, however. I hope to prove this to you. However freakish the group of characters seems, or however bizarre the plot, which includes sensational events with a young 7-year-old shooting the little girl he loves so desperately opposite, or a black man having his legs amputated in prison, suicide of Singer at the end. Actually, in feel, it's natural, it's realistic, it's life. It doesn't come across as sensational. Complete authenticity of background, I think, accounts for this to some extent. But this is the world in which Carson McCullers herself grew up. In fact, it's difficult not to identify her at almost every point in the plot with the teenage Mick Kelly, whose frequent interior monologues makes this novel a kind of female equivalent of Catcher in the Rye. I think, I've known an awful lot of men, especially American men, who say that was their Bible growing up. Well, for me, Carson McCullers' book was that kind of female equivalent, a coming-of-age novel for adolescents. Lula Carson Smith. Sounds more romantic, doesn't it, Carson McCullers? Lula Carson Smith was the eldest of 3 children, born on the 19th of February, 1917. And you'll notice that she's born in the next to last year of the First World War. And that this novel is set in 1939, in the year when war is coming. So it's with a sense, perhaps, of menace on both counts that she writes the book. She was born in Columbus, Georgia. That's Carson at the ripe old age of 50 when she died, still with the cigarette in her hand, and I won't preach a moral here. That's Carson with her husband, Reeves McCullers. I'll tell you about that. And this is her childhood home. Her childhood home in Columbus, Georgia. Not quite as seedy as the boarding house in the novel, but not very splendid either. The heart of cotton-growing country, where the cotton mills and factories, plus the picking of the cotton itself, were kept going by a mixture of black Americans and poor working-class whites, the point where Dr. Copeland and Jake Blount, the communist, come together, of course. A particularly turbulent time for race relations, especially, as I've indicated, in the late 1930s. Carson's father, Lamar Smith, was a watch repairer, rather like the man in the book, who is an engraver in a jeweller's, of gentle temperament and French Huguenot descent. And it was her mother, who was called Marguerite, who had the social pretensions. So often the case, especially in a D.H. Lawrence novel, isn't it? And she was more ambitious for her children. And it was almost certainly her drive which enabled Carson eventually to escape what she found the claustrophobic life of a small southern town. Both parents, and this again is significant, I think, in terms of what she does, what their daughter does, both parents were different from their neighbours. Most of their neighbours were deeply devout and religion occupied a central place in their life, whereas Carson's parents were more concerned with social justice. So she grew up with a sense that that was really something that mattered very much indeed, and you'll hear it in the speeches by Jake Blount, the communist, and by Dr. Copeland, who is furious that his people can't see what will help them to develop and get out of the situation. She was also encouraged to aim high in several areas. From the age of 10, when she showed musical talent, she was given a piano and piano lessons, since she showed some talent. And for some time she considered herself, and was considered, to be a musical prodigy. There's a very interesting short story called Wunderkind, Wonder Child, about somebody who's considered a prodigy, and then in what looks like autobiographical detail shows you how she realizes she's not quite good enough. It's a very compelling story. But she also started composing stories, and when her musical ambitions failed, a few years later, she turned naturally to writing. And fortunately, her gentle father had seen this and had given her a typewriter also at the age of 15. So she managed to then turn without any devastating effect to her writing. For young Mick Kelly, in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and I wouldn't have to tell you this, if you know the book, you'll know that music is very central to her life. Music is the most important thing in Kelly's life, a passion which McCullers conveys vividly throughout the book. This, for instance, and this is extract 4, is Mick listening to the first movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony on the radio. On the radio, not of her own radio, because they haven't got a radio. They're too poor to have a radio. But on the radio of a richer neighbour. She's standing in the garden. She's crept into their garden, and she's listening through the open window. Then the music started. Mick raised her head, and her fist went up to her throat. How did it come? For a minute, the opening bounced from one side to the other, like a walk or march, like God strutting in the night. The outside of her was suddenly froze, and only the first part of the music was hot inside her heart. She could not even hear what sounded after, but she sat there waiting and froze, with her fists tight. After a while, the music came again, harder and loud. It didn't have anything to do with God. This was her, Mick Kelly, walking in the daytime and by herself at night, in the hot sun, in the dark, with all the plans and feelings. The music was her, the real, plain her. She could not listen good enough to hear it all. You'll notice the way she uses Mick Kelly's prose and good enough, just to give us the flavour. This is Mick. These are her thoughts. She could not listen good enough to hear it all. The music boiled inside her. Which? To hang on to certain wonderful parts and think them over, so that later she would not forget? Or should she let go and listen to each part that came without thinking or trying to remember? Golly, the whole world was this music, and she could not listen hard enough. Then at last, the opening music came again, with all the different instruments bunched together for each note, like a hard, tight fist that socked at her heart. And the first part was over. Very difficult to describe music. Very difficult indeed. I don't know how you do it in words. Mick's passion for music runs throughout the book, as I said, so that when she feels obliged to leave school early to help her struggling family, she is also, in her own eyes, giving up the one thing that matters to her. McCullers herself believed initially that she would be able to fulfill her musical ambitions, leaving home in September 1934, age 17, for New York. with $500 pinned to her underwear. That's what they did in those days. And travel paid for by her parents, who were very devoted parents. Her plan was to study the piano professionally, to become a concert pianist, and this was serious. She got a place at the Juilliard School of Music in New York, in the great metropolis. But the rheumatic fever that she had first suffered at the age of 15 returned, and she was forced to accept that she didn't have the physical stamina for the life, because it's actually physically very demanding job, a pianist, isn't it? If you've seen that film Shine, physical exertion that is conveyed. Her first short story, Wunderkind, of course, talks about this, really, that disappointment. So after recuperating at home in Columbus, Georgia, she returned to New York to follow a writing career, and she was lucky enough to be able to go to night classes at Columbia and New York City universities while working at menial jobs such as dishwashing. They didn't have dishwashers in those days. And dog walking. Menial but nice, actually. In her 1948 essay, How I Began to Write, McCullers recalled that her first novel, A Reed of Pan, which she wrote when she was 15 and which has been lost, all the McCullers scholars hoping they're going to be the one to discover it, and this novel embodied her longing to get out of Columbus, to see New York, and to familiarize herself with the unfamiliar. The details of the book were queer, she wrote. Ticket collectors on the subway, New York front yards. But by that time it did not matter, for already I had begun another journey. That was the year. Can you remember this year of Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Tolstoy? Can you remember when you discovered the Russians? She's absolutely thrilled. And there were the intimations, she said, in those Russian writers, of an unsuspected region equidistant from New York and Georgia. Old Russia and our Georgia rooms, no, equidistant from New York, but also a sort of, in a way, connecting old Russia and her hometown. Old Russia and our Georgia rooms, the marvelous solitary region of simple stories and the inward mind. And I think that describes her very well. She has such an inward mind. Unquote. In Decision in 1941, McCullers explained that the rigid social order portrayed by the Russian realists mirrored what she had observed in her own part of the world. The Southerner and the Russian, she wrote, are both types in that they have certain recognizable and national psychological traits: hedonistic, imaginative, lazy, and emotional. There is surely a cousinly resemblance. In 1936, at the age of 19 and already very sick person, she had had a heart attack as well as a second attack of rheumatic fever and was well on her way to becoming an alcoholic, which might explain the heart attack, I don't know. McCullers had her first publication in a magazine, the short story I referred to. It would be reprinted in the Ballad of the Sad Cafe in 1951. In September 1937, on one of her convalescent trips home, she married the ex-soldier and aspiring writer Reeves McCullers. And I think theirs was probably the stuff that myths are made of. It was one of those stormy relationships, which probably they enjoyed, but must have been awful to witness, in which they would rave at each other, but basically remain together, although they did, in the end, separate for a while. A turbulent relationship, often compared to that of Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. Do you remember what they said about Dylan Thomas and his wife? The house shook with our hate. That sort of relationship, I think. Both marriages fueled by alcohol and sexual jealousies. Carson and Reeves each considered themselves bisexual, which complicated matters rather a lot. And this is a subject, the sexual fluidity, very interesting and very modern, of course, the sexual fluidity, that Biff Brannan, who's married when the novel opens and whose wife dies shortly afterwards, Biff Brannan reflects on sexual identity. He laid his finger on the side, this is extract 5, he laid his finger on the side of his nose and cocked his head to one side. He's rather in love with the adolescent boy-girl Mick. Mick had grown up so much in the year that soon she would be taller than he was. She was dressed in the red sweater and blue pleated skirt she'd worn every day since school started. Now the pleats had come out and the hem draggled loose around her sharp, jutting knees. She was at the age when she looked as much like an overgrown boy as a girl. And on that subject, Brannan reflects, why was it that the smartest people mostly missed the point? By nature, all people are of both sexes, so that marriage and the bed is not all by any means. The proof? Real youth and old age. Because often men's voices grow high and reedy and they take on a mincing walk, and old women sometimes grow fat and their voices get rough and deep and they grow dark little moustaches. And he even proved it himself, the part of him that sometimes almost wished he was a mother, and that Mick and Baby, that's her little brother, were his kids. Abruptly, Biff turned from the cash register. So you do get a sense of her venturing on subjects which were really quite daring for the time, ones that may well have meant that the publisher hesitated before accepting it. Sexual diversity is also the main theme of McCullough's second novel, Reflections in a Golden Eye, published in 1941, the year Carson and Reeves divorced. The Ballad of the Sad Cafe had been published, but only in a magazine in 1943. Carson moved back to New York alone, but she and Reeves remarried in 1945. It'd be interesting to do a book on remarriages, wouldn't it? With Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor up there. I'm sure you can tell me an awful lot of other things. So they remarried. A year later, her third and best-known novel, The Member of the Wedding, 1946, was published to great acclaim. I don't know whether you know that one, but it's been made into a very attractive film. By this time, McCullough's was moving in august literary circles, friends with people like W.H. Auden, Benjamin Britten, Gypsy Rose Lee, and the writing couple Paul and Jane Bowles. She was living with the editor of Harper's Bazaar in February House in Brooklyn, which was a famous literary gathering place. Later, she became close to Truman Capote and Tennessee Williams, so she was very well known. And of course, she was a publisher's dream. I mean, this gamin, boyish, girlish figure who suddenly appeared on the New York scene, and they made the most of it. Yet 2 years after her great success with Member of the Wedding, McCullough's tried to commit suicide. And in 1953, Reeves tried to convince her to commit a joint suicide with him in a Paris hotel. So you can see it was a very turbulent life they lived. But she fled back to America, later writing her one play, The Square Root of Wonderful, 1957, based on this traumatic experience. Her only other publication during her lifetime was The Ballad of the Sad Cafe in 1951, a novella and 6 short stories, and that last, I don't know whether any of you read this, please tell me if you have, because I have, you see, I feel terribly proud of this. It's Clock Without Hands. Anybody read Clock Without Hands? You know when you're in a place where there's nothing else to read? Sometimes quite interesting. I've read some very good books that way, especially when I was sailing down the Amazon. One got particularly short of books. She died of a brain hemorrhage in 1967 at the age of 50. And I think probably her lifestyle had much to do with that, in Nyack, New York, where she had lived for the last 20 years of her life. And this is the museum. This was the house she lived in, and it has now become a Carson McCullers museum, which is quite interesting. Despite her early move to the north, McCullers' novels are all set in the American South, all of them. And she's celebrated as one of the region's greatest novelists, probably the most remarkable the South has produced, apart from William Faulkner, of course. And a worthy inheritor of his Southern Gothic tradition. I'm always a bit puzzled by Southern Gothic. What is it? Well, it usually, all you can say is what it usually features, which is a lot of deeply flawed, disturbing or eccentric characters, ambivalent gender roles, of course that's interesting, isn't it? Decayed or derelict settings, yes, she ticks that box. Grotesque situations, yes, and other sinister events relating to or stemming from poverty, alienation, or crime or violence. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, why suddenly out of the South? Was it because it was a place of great divisions? Was it a place of great violence? Was it because there was a lot of poverty? Or was it just because she thought Faulkner was a great writer? You'll know some other writers in this genre, I'm sure. Eudora Welty and Catherine Ann Porter are two of the better known of the women novelists in that genre. Lately, I've been trying to read, I've got it, I haven't tried yet, but I'm going to read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. For obvious reasons, I thought it might be a book. It turns out to be The Cemetery, so I wasn't sure I would include it. But it's in the Southern Gothic tradition, ticks all those boxes. McCullers' genius is at least as strange as Faulkner's. I mean, when you think of As I Lay Dying, and they carry the body of their dead mother across the South, it's just extraordinarily grotesque, and all the things that happen to them on the way, and then one of the brothers breaks his leg, so they set it in concrete. Extraordinary, quite extraordinary. So she's at least as bizarre as Faulkner, which is something, but expressed with lucidity and precision. A classical simplicity is what Allen says, and I think he's right. There's something very lucid, actually. Although it's bizarre, although it's strange, although it's violent, there is something there that enables one to believe that this is a real work of art. However tortured her vision may be, there's nothing tortured or odd in the texture of her prose, and the raw material of her art is the world as she and we commonly observe it to be. The English novelist Graham Greene, a great admirer of the original poetic sensibility of both Faulkner and McCullers, prefers McCullers because she writes more clearly, he says, and at least one of her critics has compared her style to a woman she admired tremendously and read and was influenced by, Isaac Dinesen. But though McCullers does undoubtedly write more clearly than Faulkner, she writes no less poetically. It's a very poetic prose, as is evident on almost every page of this, her first full-length novel. Take, for instance, her description of Singer's train journey to see Antonopolis in his asylum, the state asylum. A long train journey, this is extract 6, through the lush southern landscape to visit his friend in the state mental hospital. When he opened his eyes again, the town was far behind him. The town was forgotten. Outside the dirty window, there was the brilliant midsummer countryside. The sun slanted in strong bronze-coloured rays over the green fields of the new cotton. There were acres of tobacco, the plants heavy and green like some monstrous jungle weed. The orchards of peaches with the lush fruit weighing down the dwarf trees. There were miles of pastures and tens of miles of wasted, washed-out land abandoned to the hardier weeds. The train cut through deep, green pine forests where the ground was covered with the slick brown needles and the tops of the trees stretched up virgin and tall into the skies. And farther, a long way south of the town, the cypress swamps, with the gnarled roots of the trees writhing down into the brackish waters, where the grey, tattered moss trailed from the branches, where tropical water flowers blossomed in dankness and gloom, almost a description, of course, of the novel itself, then out again into the open, beneath the sun and the indigo blue sky. And then here is Singer watching all this pass and longing only to see his friend, who doesn't even know he's coming. Singer sat solemn and timid, his face turned fully towards the window, the great sweeps of space and the hard elemental colouring almost blinded him. This kaleidoscopic variety of scene, this abundance of growth and colour seemed somehow connected with his friends. His thoughts were with Antonopolis. The bliss of their reunion almost stifled him. His nose was pinched and he breathed with quick, short breaths through his slightly open mouth. Terrible, terrible irony, knowing that Antonopolis really will hardly register his arrival except for the sweets which he brings. Apart from the few sensational incidents which I've referred to, the plot is fairly straightforward. The largely uneventful lives of these 5 characters over the course of about a year. So you get the change of the seasons, which is interesting in itself. But the plot is thickened and complicated by the relationship of these characters to each other. So it's not just that they all relate to Singer in his room, silent in his room at the top of the house. They all relate to each other over the period of time. And the point of view, and it's very interesting because it looks like one of those novels that is just written very naturally. When you start looking at it, you realise, in fact, that it's terribly carefully planned. So part 1, which is in 6 sections, starts with Singer's point of view, and then goes, second one is Biff, 3rd section is Mick, 4th section Jake, and 5th section Copeland, and 6th section, to round it off, is Singer again. It's extraordinarily deceptive, the ease with which she does this, but I suppose it kind of gives us an underpinning that we need in such a very free-flowing novel. It's obviously very carefully planned and yet never seems forced or contrived, and allows us a view into each of the characters' worlds from the inside and the out. And since Singer is the pivot around which the plot turns, it's obviously crucial to show us his reactions fully, and disturbing to discover that it's largely one of incomprehension. So all this time the characters have been thinking, I'll tell Singer that, he'll understand, and then we turn to Singer himself. He watched the words on their lips. We Negroes want a chance to be free at last, and freedom is only the right to contribute. We want to serve. So this, of course, is Dr. Copeland. You see, Mr. Singer, I got this music in me all the time. I got to be a real musician. And of course, we're not told who it is, but we know who that is. That's Mick. And then the drunk communist. Let's finish the bottle. I want a small one, for we were thinking of freedom. That's a word like a worm in my brain, and so on and on and on goes Jake Blount, and all the time Singer is just listening to them. He's lonely, he wants company, but he understands very little. And Biff Brannan rubs his nose and says very little. The 4 people had been coming to his room now, it ends, for more than 7 months. They never came together, always alone. And invariably he met them at the door with a cordial smile. The want for Antonopolis was always with him, just as it had been that first month after his friend had gone. And it was better to be with any person than to be too long alone. So this lack of any real communication is spelled out for us 100 pages into the book as Singer takes his long journey to visit Antonopolis. For a while, extract 8, his thoughts lingered in the town he was leaving. He saw Mick and Dr. Copeland and Jake Blount and Biff Brannan. The faces crowded in on him out of the darkness so that he felt smothered. He thought of the quarrel between Blount and the Negro. The nature of this quarrel was hopelessly confused in his mind, but each of them had on several occasions broken out into a bitter tirade against the other, the absent one. He had agreed with both of them in turn, though what it was they wanted him to sanction he did not know. And Mick, her face was urgent, and she said a good deal that he did not understand in the least. And so it goes on, and you realise even more deeply how misled all these characters are. And yet, at the same time, it does them good to have this person. It's rather like the confession box, of course, isn't it? And since they're not very religious, any of these people, I suppose, it serves as a kind of confession, although one would hope that the priest may say something at the end to help, whereas, of course, Singer can say nothing. He used to be able to talk. It's an interesting point in the book at the beginning, but he's chosen not to because he is so frightened that when his words come out that he can't hear, they will sound strange. And everybody, it isn't just the people in the boarding house, everybody in the town, the Turkish man in the shop comes up and talks to him, and of course, because he's Turkish and because he doesn't understand Turkish, he can't read his lips. It's an extraordinary thesis, really, on communication and lack of communication. There are then the other characters' reactions to each other. We're given, for example, Biff Brannan's feelings about Jake Blount, who's been sitting in his cafe getting drunker and drunker when the book opens. It's a wonderfully amusing passage in a horrible kind of way, because he just sits there and the passage ends, "Never had he seen a fellow drink so much, stay drunk so long." But the passage itself is concerned with Jake, and I mean, she doesn't just give you the inside thought. She gives you a nice description, as you'll see from here, a little bit here, a little bit there, just to indicate the kind of person. He'd noticed him immediately and watched. The man was short, with heavy shoulders like beams. He had a small ragged moustache, and beneath this his lower lip looked as if it had been stung by a wasp. There were many things about the fellow that seemed contrary. The head was large and well-shaped, but his neck was soft and tender as a boy's. So he goes on and he paints up a picture of this man, so that we are actually given quite a lot of physical description, as well as the inside of their heads. We're shown Biff's feelings for Mick, and it's here, of course, is the interesting bit, because as she changes from the tomboy in the shorts and T-shirt to the young lady who goes out to work in, I think it must be Woolworths, I'm not sure. When Woolworth, we don't have Woolworth anymore in England. Do you have a Woolworth here? Yes, of course you do. I think it's rather superior here. Yes. I was very confused when I came, because I was told that if you wanted some good stuff, you went to Woolworth, and if you wanted to have it cheap, you went to Pick and Mix. Very strange, because in England, the cheapest thing was always in Woolworth. Anyway, so she goes out to work to help the family and gives up her musical ambitions. But when she does so, she puts on her stockings, she starts to think of herself as a woman. And at the same time, Biff Brannan's interest in her, his fascination with her, diminishes. And you understand that he has got problems for himself with his sexual identity. We get Blount's deeply ironic belief in Singer's complete understanding of his viewpoint, which I won't give you, and Dr. Copeland's anger at the treatment of his fellow black people, which I mentioned to you. You see, what she does, she doesn't tell you, she shows. So he's talking to his daughter, Portia. Dr. Copeland has a daughter, Portia. And Portia works in the kitchen of the house where all these characters congregate, in the boarding house that Mick's parents own. And her father goes to see her, and he asks her, he says to her, because he's so angry at his people not taking control of their lives, and he urges her to take control of her life through things like birth control. So he's particularly angry when he asks her whether she and her husband intend to have children. And she becomes angry herself and replies, "There be some things that seem to me to depend entirely on God." Now, that's a perfectly reasonable statement, but it enrages this doctor who has been trying to cure all the ills, all the TB, all the terrible things that go on in these poor quarters of this little southern town. And he knows that as soon as she has children, she will be dragged down even further, economically and every other way. Biff's attitude towards Singer and any other disadvantaged person is interesting. He's the one who uses the word freaks. And it's an interesting study in psychology, I think, because he's like a sort of great big mother. He wants to help those who are in need. And you wonder why, but she doesn't tell you, and it doesn't matter really, but it's quite fascinating. Restlessly, Biff turned his attention to Singer. The mute sat with his hands in his pockets, and the half-finished glass of beer before him had become warm and stagnant. He would offer to treat Singer to a slug of whiskey before he left. He feels sorry for Singer. It's like somebody, you go to see them and they say, "Oh, have something to eat." Or mothers who say, "Have more," you know? And it's that very motherly feeling which is so curiously contained in this very masculine-looking man. He would offer to treat Singer then. What he had said to Alice, his wife, was true. He did like freaks. He had a special friendly feeling for sick people and cripples. Whenever somebody with a hare lip or TB came into the place, he would set him up to beer. Or if a customer were a hunchback or a bad cripple, then it would be whiskey on the house. I mean, it's understandable, isn't it, what she's saying? I mean, of course, it's a very strange thing, and nowadays we wouldn't approve of the language used. But you know people like that, people who have a tremendously soft heart towards those who are suffering. And Biff, in some ways, is a rather splendid character. There was one fellow, and I thought this was a lovely little touch, there was one fellow who had his Peter, I take it to mean his penis, who had his Peter and his left leg blown off in a boiler explosion, and whenever he came to town, there was a free pint waiting for him. It's his way of trying to do something for these people, trying to treat them, trying to soften life's blows. It's a book, really, about how hard life is for so many people, but the love that exists between this strange collection of friends is a wonderful love, and in some cases there is no love, like Singer and his boyfriend, but in other cases you feel it's very real indeed. And then Mick herself, I think probably is beautifully done, because she is the centre. And perhaps because when I was a teenager I read the book, I identified with Mick's point of view, and perhaps also because when Carson McCullers wrote the book, she was just out of her teens. But there are some lovely passages in part 2, for example. It was, "Summer was different from any other time Mick could remember. Nothing much happened that she could describe to herself in thoughts or words. But there was a feeling of change. All the time she was excited." It reminded me of being a teenager, actually. Mind you, all the time I'm excited now, so what am I talking about? But there's a particularly young feeling to this, you know. All the time she was excited. In the morning she couldn't wait to get out of bed and start going for the day. And at night she hated like hell to have to sleep again. And so it goes on. Carson McCullers wrote that she blessed the Latin poet Terence, who said, Nothing human is alien to me. You know that saying, don't you? Wonderful saying. The poet Terence, who said, nothing human is alien to me. And one of her many strengths as a writer is her deep understanding of and sympathy with other human beings, perhaps because she was such a mess herself in so many ways. She understood what was going on. She empathized. Whatever their aims, and no matter how difficult their problems, she seemed able to enter, as this book shows, into them. However tortured her vision may seem at times, she expresses this in a style of great lyric beauty and simplicity, as many of the passages show. Above all, she's writing about things that matter greatly to us all, about love and the lack of love, about loneliness and communion, however briefly, about freedom and slavery, and I'm not just talking about black slavery here, sexuality in all of its various manifestations. And above all, she's talking about the mystery of life and death. You know, there's a wonderful passage right at the end. If you're tempted to be depressed by this book, it lifts you right up again at the end. Biff Brannan is always saying, why? Brannan asked himself, why? The question flowed through Biff, always unnoticed, like the blood in his veins. He thought of people and of objects and of ideas, and the question, why, was in him. And it's this kind of central question of existence which I think Carson McCullers addresses with what one critic has called grave, sad beauty, a diffused poetic pity, a note of wary, cautious affirmation. And this is summed up beautifully in the last page, and we really have come to the end of it. Summed up beautifully on the last page with Biff's opening the door of his cafe. He hasn't shut it, but he's expecting a few people now coming in. Opening the door of his cafe and waiting for the morning sun. For in a swift radiance of illumination, this is extract 12, he saw a glimpse of human struggle and of valor, of the endless fluid passage of humanity through endless time, and of those who labor, and of those who, one word, love. His soul expanded, but for a moment only, for in him he felt a warning, a shaft of terror. Between the two worlds, he was suspended. Thank you.